All right. Welcome. It has been a long time since I was able to go live. So welcome to the Honest Youth Pastor YouTube channel. The channel helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. Today, we are going to be looking at the Shiny Happy People docu-series, documentary, I don't know what you call it, but going through it. So I've seen a bazillion videos about it, a bunch of reaction videos about it, a lot of chatter online about it, and I don't have Amazon Prime. I don't know if that's a surprise to anybody, but I don't. But I did go to my mother-in-law's house, and she has it, and I watched it over there. And so I binge watched it, which was that was a lot to take in, basically 4 hours of my life I'll never get back. But what I want to do is go over the docuseries, but also go over sort of the implications of the docuseries as well. And what I mean by that is I am an incredibly visual person, so I need everything sort of in a linear timeline. If you've watched my own video essays, documentaries that I've made, I have to have everything laid out in a timeline, or it just does not work for my brain. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to this screen here, and I don't know how well this is going to work. This is actually a test to see if this works very well. But what I want to do is give us a visual on this side of the screen of sort of the breakdown of the documentary in regards to kind of what my takeaways were, right? So what I'm going to use is this black line is going to sort of be the facts, right? So this is the end. This is the beginning of the docuseries, episodes 1 through 4, and just the facts, right? The things, the cold, hard truth facts that we know. And so they start off, if you haven't watched it, I guess I'm ruining it for you, but here we go. They start off sort of at this point here, introing into who the Duggars are. Now, to be frank with you, I didn't really watch. I mean, there was no need for me to watch the Duggars. I had more important things to do when I was a kid than when they were on. But they start off with the Duggars, right? So we're going to put, that's a terrible D. I'm sorry. Oh my goodness, guys. I told you this is a test. I didn't say it was going to work well. So they start off with the Duggars right there. Okay. So we're just going to make a D for the Duggars. And the first episode is basically an intro to who the Duggars were. I had no clue that Jim Bob, the dad, had ran and won a couple seats in some political areas in his state. Didn't know that. I didn't know how the show got started, and they kind of break that down. Very much of an intro to who the Duggars are and all of that. There is a lot of talk about Josh in the documentary. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. But the first episode is basically just, hey, here are the Duggars. And then as we sort of go into episode 2, there is this turn at the end of episode 1, as far as I could tell, into kind of introducing you into Bill Gothard and IBLP, Institute of Biblical Life Principles. And Bill Gothard is the whole guy. So we're going to put Bill here. And that's episode 2, essentially, is diving down the rabbit hole of who Bill Gothard is, all of just the basically intro into him. Really, a lot of it is sort of the intro into who he is, how he's connected to the Duggars, and sort of the surface level stuff that Bill Gothard taught. Now, episode 2, you kind of get this sense oh, okay, this is getting heavy really, really fast, but those are the facts, right? Here are the Duggars. They are connected to Bill Gothard. Bill Gothard is, doesn't seem like a real good dude, actually, whenever you're starting to get into the documentary. It's very clear that there are things that are a little shady, but you don't get a whole lot into that so much. Then we get into episode 3, and you get a lot more into Josh Duggar in this episode, right? So we're going to put a J there for Josh Duggar. And things obviously get pretty dark. So what's happened up to this point is, so episode 1, hey, here are the Duggars, here are the facts about them, how their show got started. Episode 2, hey, here's Bill Gothard. Here's all about this guy. Not a great dude, has a lot of not so awesome things happening. They sort of introduce the homeschool curriculum, the ATI stuff in here as well. And then we get to episode 3 with Josh, but we also they introduce a lot of the victims of the abuse that happened in relation to the IBLP and Bill Gothard. So we also have that dual thing over here with the victims. So we'll go V for victims there. And so by the time you get to episode 3, you have a lot of just facts that have been laid before you. So you have the Duggars and sort of how they came to be. You have episode 2 sort of linking them to Bill Gothard in episode 2. There's a ton of footage where they like spoke at the conferences that Bill Gothard put on for the IBLP. And then you kind of have the unpacking a bit of the IBLP and ATI, which is the homeschool stuff that he developed. And then you go into episode 3 where you're sort of seeing this sort of snowball effect and this link to where you really talk about like Josh Duggar's trial. We're not going to get into it here. You can Google all that. Good luck with that trash can of terrible. And so you get into Josh Duggar a little bit, and then you start mixing a bit into sort of the last episode. Now there's a little bit of sort of mixing between episode 3 and 4, but we're going to just go CN for the last episode, which basically stands for Christian nationalism. So there's this link they make between the Duggars being connected to Bill Gothard having a lot of this huge influence within a lot of churches through the Institute of Basic Life Principles. Then we have sort of Josh Duggar being connected as like this is what Bill Gothard's teaching sort of brings forth, and that's connected with a whole bunch of testimonies and interviews from victims in episode 3 as well. And then all of that sort of snowballs into episode 4, where they bring in a bunch of, well, they don't actually bring in a lot. They show a lot of clips for like a very short amount of time from what would be considered Christian influencers now, and sort of connect that to, hey, all of Bill Gothard's teachings are being perpetuated now by Christian influencers, and look at all of this. They're going to try to take over, the nation by infiltrating it. And this was Bill Gothard's plan all along. And so this is sort of what they lay out, right? Now, one of the things, let me pull this up here. So that's sort of the very foundational part, right? That's, for lack of a better term, that's sort of the facts as they were. The Duggars are a real group, a real family. They were really on TV. Hey, this is really how they became, the show. Hey, Bill Gothard's a real guy. Here's what he did. Here's all the stuff that sort of brought about. Episode 3, hey, Josh Duggar really did these things, really got convicted. Hey, also look at all these victims that also came from Bill Gothard's sort of cult, IBLP, and like look at all of that. And then episode 4 is really more of a wrap up where it's about like, hey, they're trying to take over. They're still going, even though Bill Gothard technically isn't still going. And there's also a big sort of deconstruction sort of tone in episode 4. Deconstruction from Bill Gothard's teachings primarily, but we'll talk about sort of the other undertone in a minute. So with the red, I want to sort of have oh my goodness gracious. All right, hold on. Here we go. Okay. So what we have here is the black line is the facts. The red line here is going to represent sort of the things they tie into it, right? So with any story you're telling, there are going to be like the foundational facts, and then there's going to be a layer on top of that of things that are sort of connected, but not. And it really depends on how you tell the story of how connected they are, right? When I did the Mike Todd video essay and the Andy Stanley video essay, my hope was to lay down sort of the facts and then kind of say, here are some other things that seem to be connected, but I want you to make that call. And I was very intentional in not trying to put my presuppositions into that. Now, I don't know how well I did, but that was my goal, was not to kind of like lay my presuppositions on top of that. What we see in this documentary is the facts represented here in the black line. And then we also have some presuppositions that they lay on top of those facts. So for example, the Duggars, on top of the Duggars and the huge family, they sort of connect, big families as, oh, well, if you're a big family, you're probably like the Duggars, right? So if you want a lot of kids, you're probably thinking a lot like the Duggars, right? And that's sort of a presupposition they lay on top of that. When they get to episode 2 and the Bill Gothard thing, they go really heavy on his homeschool stuff, the ATI, the curriculum that he made in order to sort of integrate his principles into the homes of the people that followed what he said. And so there's this presupposition they lay on top of episode 2 that, they don't do anything to sort of dissuade you from thinking that all homeschooling is basically indoctrination as well. Like, that's really sort of the tone they lay on top. Now, I don't know if that's intentional or not, but that's what's sort of being communicated. And again, with anything, any story you tell, there are going to be the foundational things, and then there are going to be, that's the black line we have here, and then the red line are going to be sort of the things you're connecting there. And if you're not careful, there's going to be presuppositions made, or if you're purposely trying to make a connection that may not be there, it's really easy to do that by, building the story and saying, hey, Bill Gothard did ATI, homeschooling is terrible. Or just having somebody say, yeah, the stuff that I was homeschooled with was bad. And then there's this innate connection between homeschooling being bad and it all be connected to sort of the same thing that Bill Gothard taught. There's never an effort made, and the reason I think that it was sort of intentional is there's never an effort made in the documentary to say that homeschooling in general is not the same thing as what Bill Gothard was doing. It's sort of all lumped in together. Same thing with the big family. If you have a big family, you're obviously like part of the term they keep using during the documentary, which I guess was the Bill Gothard term, was quiverful, which was the idea you have a lot of kids, you can send them all out into the world to spread, the message of whatever you want the message to be. In this case, Bill Gothard's teaching. And it's sort of connected that if you have a big family, you're kind of like the Duggars, and of course you want to do the same thing the Duggars do. If you homeschool, you probably are trying to indoctrinate your kids in a similar way that, Bill Gothard was trying to indoctrinate kids. That's sort of the presupposition. When you get to episode 3, you have a real tone being built that, and one of the lines that's said over and over again is that these sorts of institutions give access or are fertile grounds for abusers. Now, again, if you're just looking at the cold hard facts line, right? If you're just looking at the line that says, hey, the Duggars followed Bill Gothard's teachings, Bill Gothard has a bunch of abuse connected to him, and Josh Duggar is an example of that abuse, and hey, look at all these other victims that were abused in Bill Gothard's program. If you just stick to those facts, you can be like, wow, yeah, Bill Gothard, terrible guy, built a system that really was very heavy on authority no matter what happened. And then they connect that to, well, if you have a big family and you want to homeschool and you have this idea that there should be sort of some family structure, then you're the same thing. And so this sort of goes back to, there's this whole authority, real big authority bent. I know you can't read that, but it's a huge authority bent, but in the negative. So if there's really any authority, then it's bad because it can be connected back to the same thing that Bill Gothard was teaching. And so that's sort of the presupposition laid on top of episode 3. And then we go into episode 4. And then we start having a lot of, this is where we sort of have this really short snippet of Christian influencers that are brought in. Paul and Morgan, I think, are the only ones that are actually interviewed. And the only question they ask Morgan in the film is, what is the wife's duty? And Morgan says to submit to her husband. And then they cut it. Well, before this point, they've really, really talked about, hey, Bill Gothard talked a lot about authority, and authority was this huge thing, and authority builds, is a breeding ground for abusers. And then when you cut to, the influencers that they say, hey, these influencers are carrying on the same sort of thing as Bill Gothard taught, and you cut to Morgan, from Paul and Morgan, and she says, well, my job is to submit to my husband's authority, then automatically your brain, as you're watching this, says like, oh, that's what she's talking about. The authority that they were talking about before that bred all this abuse that Bill Gothard talked about, that the Duggars obviously did, that, sort of gave room for Josh Duggar to do what he wanted to do. That's what Morgan's talking about. And so you have these, I'm just going to put Christian influencers. My writing's terrible. Whatever. You get the point of what I'm trying to do here. And so you sort of have that red line of presuppositions built on top of this black line of facts through the entire series. And so what begins to happen is that when you do that, right? So whenever you lay down, the facts as you go through, but at the same time, you're also sort of laying down these presuppositions on top of the episodes, they get very intertwined to where you can't separate them. So let me explain sort of how this happens then, right? So whenever this came out, I don't have a clue when it came out, a few weeks ago. I work all the time. When I'm not working, I'm doing something at the church, or I'm playing with my kids, or I'm doing stuff like this and making videos. So I didn't even know it was coming out. I had no clue it was even a thing. But I get home the day or a couple days after it aired, and my wife had mentioned that she had watched it and she wanted me to watch it too to get my opinion on it. Now, here's the thing. I have had a little bit of interaction with Paul and Morgan. My wife has no clue who Paul and Morgan are. And so I had saw Paul and Morgan post about this, about how they were in it, and they felt like the documentary didn't portray them in the way that they had told they were going to be portrayed, yada, yada, yada. Here's the point. I come home and say, hey, yeah, was there a couple in there named Paul and Morgan? And these are the two things my wife remembered about Paul and Morgan from the documentary. One of them was Morgan and the clip they used whenever she was going, you can't be a they, them people. You can't be a they, them. Just pick one. And she remembered Morgan talking about submission to her husband in connection with the submission storyline they had built before on the black line here on the facts. And so whenever you have somebody that is just watching this, now again, my wife is a very, very smart woman, very discerning individual. Obviously, there were things that she was picking out the whole time, which is why she wanted to watch it with me so we could kind of pick through it together. And so there were things that she said, oh yeah, that's a Christian principle that's been distorted, or that's not a Christian principle that he took and ran with. So she was able to pick through that. But the really interesting thing to me was that when she got to the Paul and Morgan part, because she didn't know who they were, the assumption was that oh yeah, Morgan's this crazy person connected to this whole Bill Gothard situation. That's how she saw it as it was portrayed in the documentary. And so that's the interesting part, is that you have this storyline that is built on facts, as far as the Duggars are real people that had a real show. Bill Gothard's a real guy that had a real institution. Josh Duggar did have free reign in this system that sort of distorted what a biblical authority was, and all of these things. And these victims really did come from these institutions and this sort of teaching, and these people are having to work through a lot of really dark things. And then it rolls sort of all of that into, ironically, the whole time as you go through this documentary, they're like, hey, these people, these fundamentalists, these Christians, this is what they're trying to do. And then you get to a point, basically, hold on, let me do this real quick. Basically between episode 3 and 4, where Bill Gothard's Institute is sued, shut down, the ATI principle stuff can't be taught as official homeschool stuff. You can basically just buy it. And Bill Gothard, for all intents and purposes, is shut down. He doesn't have his institute anymore. And so what the film is forced to do is to basically use the same tactic as they've been saying Bill Gothard has been using the whole time, which he has, which is fear. So the whole selling point on Bill Gothard's thing was that, hey, you have to teach your kids because culture is going to teach them. And, here's the umbrella system that you got to use, and there's got to be all this authority and da-da-da-da-da. And so he takes a lot of biblical principles, distorts them, but uses fear to sell them, basically. And the ironic part is when you get to the end, episode 4, the documentary uses the same tactic. And it says, hey, these Christians, I know Bill Gothard shut down. I know Josh Duggar's in prison. What's going to happen, though, is that they're still going. And if you don't stop them, they're going to take over the country. And this is when they bring in the Christian influencers. And this is also the part where they, another presupposition that I want to touch on here that I think is necessary. One of the things that they lay, especially on episode 4, a little bit on episode 3, is this idea that Bill Gothard and the IDLP and conservative Christianity are one and the same. they do nothing to separate these two things. And so, so you talk about like LGBTQ, that's directly connected. Hey, if somebody is against same-sex unions, they're basically the same kind of person as Bill Gothard. Hey, if somebody is against abortion, they're basically the same person as Bill Gothard. And so there's a lot of things that are lumped in that are truly biblical principles, that are lumped in with Bill Gothard, that basically says that, hey, if you know somebody, so you get all the way to the end of this film, and it goes, hey, if you know somebody that, is against same-sex unions, is against baby deletion, wants to, has some sort of biblical authority system in their home where, the man is the leader, and, he leads his family and provides and protects for his family. Like all of that is lumped in with Bill Gothard. And so there's no distinction made whatsoever between like Bill Gothard and his problematic principles for sure, and the victims that it did produce, and actual conservative Christianity. And so there is no distinction at all made there. So what you have, and this is why I say, and this is why it's really important whenever we watch things, to understand that there are that black line, there are factual things, there are real facts that are the foundation of what's being said here. Again, Duggars are real. Bill Gothard's a real dude. He made a real institution. Josh did terrible things. There are victims that of both Josh's and other people in the IDLP. That's a true thing. And then on that foundation, there's that red line, that presuppositions that are then built on top of that, right? Hey, if you have a big family, right? If you have more than 2 or 3 kids, are you like the Duggars? Hey, if you want to homeschool your kids, are you basically indoctrinating your kids like Bill Gothard did? Like, if you have some sort of authority system that you believe in, right? Does that mean you're going to, like, is it a system for abuse? Like, I just need to break apart here real quick. There was, for real, there have been people that have been like, I bet the Honest Youth pastor's wife is like locked in a basement somewhere because she can't get away. And it's because we believe in a biblical principle of I'm supposed to lead, protect, and provide. That doesn't mean she doesn't have a say in anything. It just means that as soon as I say I'm a complementarian, the whole world explodes because there's this system of authority set up and it gets connected to the terrible side and the misuse of that sort of thing. But that's sort of the picture that's painted here. And then again, it goes into this last episode is it's front-ended, very fear-based in regards to, hey, I know Bill Gothard and Josh are kind of shut down, but there's a whole new group of people coming up behind them and you need to watch out for these people. And here's some examples. And it's like, I've never heard of Nate and Sutton, but apparently that's a group they use. There's Paul and Morgan, they lump in with them as well. And it's basically like, hey, if there is anyone that's running for office that isn't pro LGBTQ, if there's anybody running for office that, isn't, pro-choice, if there's anybody running for office that believes anything about headship in the home or is even connected at all with the Bible, you need to watch out for those people. And that's what it's front loaded with. And then the back half, and I've got to end this here in a minute, but the back half is very heavily loaded with deconstruction. Now, there is a good side of deconstruction in which these people that they're interviewing have grown up within Bill Gothard's teaching, and there is a lot of that has to be sort of deconstructed from. And some of them seem to be doing it to greater or lesser extents. I mean, you can't really tell from the interviews, to be frank with you, but some of them are doing it to greater or lesser extents, depending on the interview they're giving. Some of them, though, and they sort of load the back end with these people that are basically saying like, hey, if you've grown up in this, and again, they're not making a distinction. So I don't have a clue. I didn't have a clue who Bill Gothard was before I watched this documentary. There were some similar things that I sort of saw with like James Dobson. That was sort of who we grew up with. Like in the documentary, for example, there was an example of somebody on a podium that was like, they spank the kid, then they give him a hug. and told him they love him. That was sort of a similar thing to like the James Dobson thing. I remember getting whipped when I was a kid and being told this hurts me more than it hurts you. And so there's part of these things that do sort of need to be worked through, broke down, deconstructed. See, do they actually connect with Scripture, right? Real discernment used. And then there's other parts where people go all the way and they're like, well, this is Christianity and I'm not wanting to be connected with it at all. There's a comment in the comment section that says, I think Ginger Duggar has done it correctly. Or Jenner Duggar. I don't know who that is, but I think that's probably the one that has, it is still within the church, is going to is part of a local body of believers. And so that's the part where you say, okay, what was bad here? What was taken from Scripture and then distorted and made it look like it was Scripture? And then what was not at all? And what do I need to let go of and what do I need to hold on to? But they don't break that down in the documentary. So what you're left with, honestly, this was my takeaway. You can let me know in the comments what your takeaway was, is that you sort of build up to, hey, look at the Duggars. They're these Christian people that have principles. And then here's the dark side of that. And the underbelly is Bill Gothard. And like, look what Bill Gothard's teachings lead to with Josh Duggar. And then sort of dovetailed out from Josh Duggar are a plethora of other victims that have come from Bill Gothard's teachings. And then there's no effort to make a distinction between Christianity, conservative Christianity, and Bill Gothard. It's sort of lumped in one and the same. Now, again, it's never explicitly said that way, but how you cut the documentary matters. Like visual and audio coming together in a very purposeful way sort of sets a tone. So when they're talking about Bill Gothard and they're talking about how, his teachings was about authority and submission in the home, all of that is lumped together. When you're seeing pictures of people used, especially in the last, like the episode 3 and 4, of people like protesting baby deletion, that's directly connected to Bill Gothard. So if you're against baby deletion, you must be like Bill Gothard. So that's the point, I guess. So all of that to say, as I wrap this up, when we watch things, we have to be really careful about how we watch them. We have to be discerning. What's that black line? What are the facts? What's the foundation? What's accurate? What's true? What can be verified? And then on top of that, what are the things that are being put on the screen, the audio being used, the interviews being played, that are assumptions being laid on top of those facts and then intertwined like that bottom line? Because what's really easy to do is when we watch something, you can intertwine those facts with those assumptions and not know it. So by the time you get to the end, right? By the time I got to the end of the documentary, I was like, man, Christians are terrible. They're all like Bill Gothard. If that's what I'm left with here. And if I grew up in a home even similar to this, right? Not if I grew up in an IBLP home, but if I grew up in a home even similar to this, I really need to deconstruct my faith. And really what you're left with is just abandon it entirely. And so that's one of the things that I think we really need to be careful with a lot of these documentaries coming out. Like, to be honest, a lot of them are doing, unfortunately, what the church should have already done, which is point out these false teachers, these abusers, these scripture twisters, and kick them out. And because in some instances that hasn't happened, we have documentaries like this where Bill Gothard was accepted and not pushed back on, or at least not to any extent that I'm aware of. We have documentaries like the Hillsong one that came out, in which there were a lot of people screaming from the rafters about Hillsong, but nobody paid attention, and then this is what you get. And so you have documentaries that unfortunately do come with sort of that bias on top of them, unfortunately, that either purposefully make no distinction, or they just simply don't really know there is a distinction. And so what they're left with is, this must be all Christians. And I don't want to make an assumption on anybody's part about whether they do know there's differences or they don't know there's any differences. For as far as I know, again, if you haven't been around biblical churches, well-run churches, scripturally sound churches, you may be left to the assumption that there are quote unquote progressive Christians, and then there are all the fundamentalists that you just lop into one big bucket and you don't make a distinction. Maybe that's what they're doing, or maybe they purposefully painted this with a broad brush. I don't know. I do not know, but that's what we're left with. So all that to say, hopefully when we watch these things, we come at them and say, okay, what's the cold hard facts? What do I know? What's the assumptions that's laid on top of it? And we pay attention to the visuals and the audios and the interviews that are being used. Because the truth is, there were real victims that were really hurt and really abused because of very messed up systems. And thankfully, they're able to tell their story now. It's unfortunate that a secular company had to do that, and the church, didn't step in and stop that when it should have. But now we have, at least they're able to tell their stories now. And so it's one of those things where, like, it's good that it's being shown. Same thing with the Hillsong documentary. I haven't seen that one yet, but from what I understand, it's a good thing that these terrible things are being shown. It's unfortunate that there's not being a distinction that says, hey, the Bible actually teaches against the Biegacki's and, the Hillsongs, and everything's being lumped in together. So that's where really we as believers, there's a good sort of silver lining to this, is that we as believers actually get to be the apologists of our day and go out and say, well, actually, like, there are distinctions. Let's kind of talk through these a little bit. Because whether you like it or not, Shiny Apple People is, I think if I read right, the #1 watched thing on Amazon Prime right now. So it's very likely the people you work with, your friends that aren't believers, your acquaintances that you run into have probably seen it. And so it could be a great thing, actually, to really open up opportunities to talk to them and say, hey, do you see that movie? Let's kind of talk through it a little bit, because this is what he believes. This is actually what the Bible says. This is what happened, and this is how the Bible actually has things in place to prevent abuse, as you see in the video or in the film. And so it should hopefully give us an opportunity to be a witness to Christ. And even through all of this terribleness, God can still get the glory and Christ can be glorified. And that would be the hope at the end of the day, all of that together. So guys, thanks for tuning in. If you have any input, comments, anything like that, leave them in the comment section below. Guys, thanks for all the likes so far and the people that have been interacting in the chat. I appreciate you guys, and I'll talk to you later.